What you're about to hear is a conversation between two friends. It's raw, at times emotional, and really authentic. It happened naturally. It progressed over time. In fact, the conversation began, all this happened a few weeks ago, over lunch at the Elijah Rising office between Micah and Tamika. And as they got deeper and deeper and started to realize how much they had in common and how much they did not have in common, they decided that it was important to turn on the recording devices. So they went into the podcast studio, turned on the lights, turned on the camera. And the whole goal there was that you, the listener or the watcher of this podcast, would learn something from their conversation. That you'd be challenged by it as much as they were challenged by it in the moment. That you'd be spurred on to action to respond to it and to do something. So that's the whole reason why we're going to be listening to their conversation today. So that you might be impacted by their conversation, by their experiences as two executive directors of nonprofits that are fighting sex trafficking, and experiencing how that intersects with racism.
Well, Tamika, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Tamika, you lead United Against Human Trafficking, another anti-trafficking organization here in Houston. You're the executive director there, and I'm so honored to have you on this podcast today with me. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to spend time with you. I love you so dearly, and this is an honor for me to be here today with you.
Well, same. And, just for our listeners, if you haven't encountered her organization, UAHT, we fondly call it, or if you haven't encountered her as a person, I just want to say how beloved you are and how much I have been just so really honored and challenged and blessed by getting to know you over the last about a year or so. I really look up to you as another leader. You've been in the position of directorship for a little longer than I have, and so you have a lot of amazing experience just leading people. And so I definitely call you sometimes to ask you for your opinion. Highly value your insight, and so it's really an honor to have you here, not just as an executive director, but just as a person, and as you're going to share a little bit about your experiences, both in leadership and in the movement. And so I'm really happy. I hope you get to share everything that is really on your heart today.
Yeah, I think that I would just say ditto to you and the impact you've had on my life. As we've really been able to connect closely. It's been so important to me to feel as if I had an ally in the movement, in the seats that we sit in. And so to have you be there in times that I have needed you and supporting me is truly a blessing, and so critical, particularly at a time like this in our country, is to have folks who are coming together and uniting at a time that is so critical for all of us to come together. So
yeah, it's a tough season. Right? It's raw, it's hard. But today, as we begin to have more and more conversations around racism, around bias, around prejudice, and how they impact even the anti-trafficking movement, we want to create a safe space, right? And you're a safe person. And that's because we've walked a little bit together in friendship and leadership. And so there's a place of trust there and a foundation of understanding one another that I think we're even building upon today. And so even as we go forward, it's like, how do we go forward together, right? And so even, just to do kind of a 90-degree turn almost, it's like, I guess there's no easy way to step into this space and to step into this conversation except for just establishing a baseline of honesty and transparency and humility. And so I just want you to know that I'm here to listen. I'm here to hear, and to just share my experience too, right? Of my, becoming more awakened to the issue of racism and prejudice. And, specifically today we'll talk about how it intersects sex trafficking, human trafficking. But at the end of the day, you're a human, you're a person, and you've encountered it personally. And so I would love to hear, as much as you want to share, just how you feel that you've encountered racism in your own life.
Yeah, I think For me, when I hear that question and when I have heard it throughout my life, how to explain my experience, whether it's personally or professionally, I always take pause because it is so intimate and close to my heart to talk about the pain of that in my life. But I think it's important to be able to release that as much as possible. And I think for me, the best way to do that is to talk about it. As a social worker by trade, although I'm an ED, I definitely bring that skill set to the position. And so in social work, we always talk about leaning into the discomfort of the conversation, leaning into the discomfort of just the pieces of life that can be very treacherous and hard. And so when you talk about experiences and discrimination and racism, it's very much something I've dealt with my whole life. Yeah. I grew up in a very impoverished neighborhood as a kid, very heavily policed neighborhood, single mother, doing the best that she could to take care of me and my two brothers. And with that upbringing, when I was 10, I was kind of propelled into a world of whiteness by going to schools, and that I was, a lot of times the only African American in the schools and the talented and gifted programs, whatever you want to call them. So I was, from the very beginning, really introduced to what that looked like. Really hadn't experienced that as a child very much. My mom and my dad are very open, loving people, embrace all. So to have that experience at like 10, I remember going to a pool party for the first time at one of my classmates' house and experiencing some things at that time. And as I got older, for the first time when I was 16, being called the N-word with friends, and I was the only African American at that time in that situation, and then just throughout my life having experiences like that. And professionally, just when you have experienced a trajectory that I have where you've actually moved through your career and actually been able to elevate to certain positions, it becomes even more paramount in your life because people don't look at you as a leader. At times, they don't see you as the leader in the room. They make assumptions about what your role is. And so for me, it's been a lot of trying to find a balance between how to show love, because that's what I'm naturally inclined to do. That's who I am as a person. That's how I grew up, is always demonstrating that. And I think that that's the only way we can, really combat racism, is to counter it with love. And that's where the healing begins, I believe.
Yeah. That's, for some of our listeners, they don't get the opportunity to know you personally, but I can truly say that I don't know many people, and I don't know if I could think of one person who embodies the grace and the humility and just the kindness that you just exemplify on a daily basis. And I think that's one of the reasons why I reach out to you for so many things, for just your perspective, because you truly have a heart for caring for people. And it's so refreshing. One of the things we talked about whenever we were preparing for this podcast was your heart for making sure that people move from a place of the conversation to reconciliation, or how do we even go in that direction? So I can honestly say that that's just who you are in your spirit, in your character, and your nature. And it's almost like creating a safe space for both sides to have the conversation, is saying we actually want to get to a place of reconciliation and a place of redemption, really, where things are restored and, the beauty is brought back in where there's been brokenness, And so that, but your story hasn't been all rosy, you're I know there's a lot more that you could tell us right now. You're kind of holding back, and that's totally fine. It's totally appropriate. There's probably a lot more layers of things that you've faced just personally as a woman, probably, and then as an African American woman, and then as an African American leader. All these different levels of places where you've had to come up against roadblocks and even oppression or bias or prejudice. And so I'm sure that you have a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of experience to bring to the conversation,
Yeah, I think, and thank you for, just honoring that. And think there's so much power in words. One of my favorite quotes Maya Angelou says is, words are things. They stick on your walls, they stick in your clothes, they get on the table, they get in the chair, and eventually they get into you. And so for me, I try to live a life where I know that my words can heal and impart kindness and love in a time where many people believe we should be standing up and yelling and, using our voices in a very powerful way, whether it's being angry or, or raising our fist and saying it's enough. And I agree with all that. It's enough. It's time out. However, I do believe there's a way to get to where we're trying to get, like I said before, by coming together. But in that path, acknowledging the pain, because there's so much pain.
Yeah.
I have pain.
Yeah.
And I think when you acknowledge that pain and just listen and affirm it, which is what you do, and you're so tender with that, Micah, it helps build that bridge.
Yeah.
And that's what we need in a time like this.
Yeah.
Is to build bridges to one another. And to truly do that, we have to sit in a place of humility and not in a place of righteousness, because we've all done things we shouldn't have. I've maybe historically said things I shouldn't say. Nobody's perfect. You can't grow up in America and live in America and not have racist things in you, because that's all that's perpetuated so often, particularly here in the South.
Yeah.
And I grew up and was raised in the South.
Yeah. Gosh, that's really a powerful statement. And I'm reminded of this, it's always stuck with me. Dr. Dan Allender, he's like a therapist.
Teach me.
He said this phrase, I'm not going to say it perfectly, but he's a therapist, he's a counselor, and he's like, if you really have to take off your shoes before you walk into someone's story, meaning that, or implying that, in the Bible, they talked about like taking off your shoes, you're in holy ground, and really reverencing people's pain and people's stories. And so our heart, even here at Elijah Rising, our heart is to take off our shoes before we walk into someone's story. And our kind of process, I'll say my process, has been, I don't think I've done that really well in the past. I think I've raised my fist, and let's just take human trafficking, for example. I ran headlong into the fight, so to speak, or advocacy, but I didn't really take the time, I'm realizing now, to sit with the pain, to sit with the personal stories, to sit with the individual experiences of the people that I'm trying to advocate for and serve. And so it's painful, right? It's painful for, and I don't want to put words in your mouth by any means, but it's painful on one side to say, like, we've been carrying, let's say, the fight against prejudice or for equality or for a lack of bias for years, and you've been trying to say these things and advocate for these things, and then it's painful on the other side too to say, for me, for example, as a white woman, if you can't see me, to say, oh my gosh, to realize I have been complicit in systems that have brought either systemic racism or oppression or prejudice. And you said something really powerful. You can't live in America and not be kind of complicit or intertwined maybe with the culture of racism. And I think that even 6 months ago, I wouldn't have understood that. I don't know that I fully understand it now, but I do believe, like, I feel like I'm waking up to that reality that some of the ways that our country was built, and science even shows this, that like from generation, the belief systems of generation after generation after generation passed down through, the generations, the family members actually, kind of help to communicate a narrative maybe unintentionally. And so there's all these systems within America that have been, like, let's just look at our textbooks, right? I mean, you look at the history, you look at all images on stock photos, and it's really hard to find Black people, right? And it's really hard to find Black heroes in the history books. It's really hard to find neighborhoods that are integrated. I mean, all of those things were by design. And now we're living in the fruit of those things, and it's just like become our normal. And I think a lot of people don't understand the history. They don't understand the intentionality that some of these systems were designed with originally, right? And it's been so long that we kind of take it for granted. But those are places where bias is intertwined and interwoven with our narrative. But now we get to dissect that and hopefully dismantle that, you know.
Yeah, I think that, people a lot of times in conversations, they want to give quotes, they want to give stats, they want to say, well, this is what the percentage of this is this. And I think that's all relevant. I think it's important, but if I was a researcher, I would definitely be a qualitative researcher instead of a quantitative, because the quality of relationships, the quality of how we engage one another, not the numbers, even though they're really important and critical. I think people can get lost in that, because that helps it stay here in our heads and really cerebral instead of in our hearts, which is where the stories are, which is where I believe true change happens. You can give me a number all day long about what's happening in the prison system, in the criminal justice system with Black and brown folks, or what's happening on the streets, all those pieces. But at the end of the day, if I don't have an experience like we're having today in a conversation and building a relationship, it's going to be very difficult to bring those two together, because you have to really be clear on what the true root of it is in our society. I think in human trafficking, like I shared with you earlier, me coming into the movement about 5 years ago and looking around and asking the question, where are the people of color? Let alone African Americans. I mean, where are they? How did we miss this? And talking at every level of organizations. And I think that there's a reason why there's an undertone in this movement. And until we're able to pluck that reason out and truly pluck it out, and everyone is willing to do that, and that's everyone, that's me, that's you, it will continue to resonate, and it will continue to impact the people that we're all trying to serve. The whole reason why we work for nonprofits, we sacrifice, so much of our lives and in our families and our, relationships to do this work. We should make the same level of sacrifice to really pluck out the evil of racism, because that's what it is. And it's not just plucking it out in someone else's space, in your own space, looking yourself in the mirror and being like, Tamika, I probably shouldn't have had that thought. Where did that come from? Oh, wow. Let me recognize it, reject it, and replace it with something that truly represents who I want to be as a human being. I think it's critical, and especially as a leader who's leading other folks in this movement.
And that's a tough question, right? I'm sure that even that realization, where are the people of color? Where are the Black people in the movement? And that's even something that we've asked internally and saying, how do we engage different demographics, right? Right now just to be very honest, like I feel the anti-trafficking movement is kind of led by a lot of white people. And so that's a conversation that we've even asked ourselves. How do we make space for? How do we engage? How do we attract? I don't know what it is, just different demographics, Black, even Asian, Latin American, like the people who we see are being directly impacted by human trafficking are people of color disproportionately.
Because not all.
Not all.
Not all, clearly.
And that's, and that's what something too is like, yes, it affects, we say that all the time. It affects every, it's not an ageist, it's not a racist, it affects every demographic. But when we go out on the street, when we go into the cantina brothels, we go into the massage parlors, we see Asian, Latin American, Black. And so I don't know what the answer is to that. I don't know where, I don't know how we shift that. And like you're saying, there has to be something kind of rooted in the fabric of the movement to kind of, okay, here are the essentially people of color are being marginalized and oppressed and hurt by this injustice. But then there's the white people essentially who are advocating on their behalf, but maybe we haven't even listened to their stories fully. And so how do we even solve that? Like, I don't know if I have an answer for that. You know what I mean? How do we do that?
Yeah, and I think a part of the journey, Micah, is not necessarily the solution. We often want to have this idea that there is one solution that fits all.
Yeah.
And I think that it's going to be different for every individual depending upon their story and their experience. I think there's an equal responsibility, Micah, on people of color, particularly African American folks, to get involved in the movement because it's their babies, okay? It's their sisters. It's their family members that are on Bissonnette.
Right.
There's a responsibility, but there's a shame, particularly in our culture, when it comes to elements that relate to sex and drugs and what's the oppression for so many years has really, how it's impacted our community. So what you do at times is you want to run in the other direction because it's too painful to see people who look just like you suffering in that way all day, every day. So how do we equally take responsibility, the same responsibility that we're asking of our Caucasian brothers and sisters, we have to ask of ourselves. And we have a responsibility to speak up and speak out for the people who are victimized that look like us. Okay? And so I want to honor our white brothers and sisters who have led the way. Because if it wasn't for you on so many levels, where would the movement be? So I think it's important to always give grace and love to folks who had the right intention, who were trying their best to do what was right, And it's important to take a step back and breathe, for a moment, just to breathe in the moment that we're in, because people were trying to do the right thing. And we have to honor that. I wouldn't have the job that I have if there weren't people before, even if they look like you, trying to do the right thing. And we have to honor that. And that's why I believe in reconciliation more than anything, because that's how you honor. I believe. That's my belief. That's how I live my life.
That's really powerful. That's really powerful because it gives grace to, it gives validity to every person's story and every person's voice and every person's efforts, right? So it's not as cut and dry.
No.
It's so not, it can't just be one-sided. It's not just a one-sided conversation. And so it's nuanced. And I think that's what makes it a hard conversation. There's not an easy fix. There's not an easy answer. And even sometimes the terminology that we use, both in the anti-trafficking movement and in this new, well, it's not new at all, but the conversation that is happening and terminology is tricky. You know what I mean? Like we just have to listen and give ear. And whenever we walk in so much grace and humility, like you're doing right now, is when we can actually open up those doors, right?
Yeah. And I think, I have a very, those who don't know, I have a very, I don't want to say militant side, but that's what's coming to me right now.
You know what? It's okay.
I'm just saying, and I really do. I know you do too, girl. I know we both got it. We have to just, but as we sit in the seats we sit in, we have to sometimes, keep that in a place that's appropriate.
Check
and so
yourself.
check yourself before you wreck yourself.
That's right.
Okay? No. So ultimately, when I say that, I mean there are pieces of me that are frustrated, angry, pissed off. Like, what is really going on in the world? Like, for real? But that's just that flesh and that immediate response that comes up. And you have to take a minute to breathe and move forward. Like I was running at Rice. Was it this week? What's today? I was running at Rice and I saw a sign, and this is in Rice University, and it's a beautiful sign on University. And it said, it had a picture of George Floyd, his eyes closed. And it said, ... breathe and vote. And it says, Black votes matter. And when I saw that sign, I stopped. I took a picture of it, and I was like, ooh. I wasn't sure how I felt about it first. But I thought, you know what? There are many people who are in the streets protesting, doing all those things, have been doing it for like 2 weeks now. But my challenge is, what are we going to do next? Are you going to be voting? The primary is coming. Are you going to vote? I asked my family this. Are you going to make change that is systemic and use your voice in that way? Okay? There is a way to go about this work and a way to impact change that we all play a part in. And we all have equal responsibility in making that change. So the militant part of me was like, who's voting? Let me go ask, because people died for the ability for my people to vote. Thousands, if not more, died for that right. Exercise it if you want to see change.
Hey everybody, I hope you are enjoying today's episode of the Elijah Rising podcast. Right now I'm standing in the Elijah Rising store that sells goods that empower survivors of sex trafficking. All the items in this shop, the purchases support the employment as well as the restoration of women that are in our program. So please come visit us at 11th and Studewood or online at shop.elijahrising.org. And today on your first purchase, we're going to offer you $10 off if you shop online using code podcast.
So, Tamika, even here at Elijah Rising, right? So we have been taking this opportunity to really look intrinsically, look at ourselves, and where do we need to make changes? Like, where have we not been listening or didn't know to listen, or maybe have been operating like kind of on cruise control, and we've been complicit in systemic racism or even bias. And I'll just tell you kind of just my personal history, my personal story as it relates to Elijah Rising. But, I obviously grew up my mom was white, a single mom as well. I don't remember a time when I felt racist ideology or talk or anything like that. So I really grew up thinking it was kind of a non-issue, or it had been eliminated or what have you. Fast forward to when I was about 21, I moved in with a Black family from my church, and it was a culture shock on multiple levels because there were multiple people in the household. There was a father and a mother. It was just very different, but it was so good and such an amazing season of my life. So I lived with them for about 7 years, and they have become, and still to this day are, my family. Like, I call them mom and dad. And I call them on the phone before I call my real mom, my biological mother. They were in many ways like just there for me, raising me, in that really formative time. And so, but even in that, even living with a Black family for that long, these issues didn't come up. And, my father even has another layer of like intersectionality where he was in prison for multiple years. And so just with all of these things, I really had this worldview that racism is a non-issue. We really have overcome this as a nation because I believe it didn't intersect my world. And I guess I didn't have enough of the voices. I didn't hear enough of the stories. I wasn't really on media. So so all of these things, I'm living in this kind of bubble, I guess you could say. Fast forward to when I'm working at Elijah Rising, and we begin caring for, serving, reaching out to the people that we serve and reach out to, who are mostly people of color, right? Fast forward even further to where we have, and myself primarily, have established a museum. Like, we call it the Museum of Modern Day Slavery. And so I say all of that because there are so many ways that this last, 6, 8, 12 months have been just awakening a really deep grief in me. To see where I was complicit in these systems, or I was ignorant of these systems, or involved in bias and not even really knowing it. And like you said, having the best of intentions, but I'll just say, so for example, the museum, right? The museum is called the Museum of Modern Day Slavery. And it's not just today that now we're having this conversation, but even, months ago, having the awakening to say, maybe that is not even an appropriate name. And literally I walked around as my heart is becoming more aware, as I'm understanding the terminology, really, like, what is white privilege? Like, what is implicit bias? Like, what is systemic racism? Like, even just understanding the terminology, giving an ear to those voices. Like, walked around the museum yesterday, and I'm seeing a bunch of white faces, wow. And the museum is designed, if you haven't been there, it's designed to give voice to the Latin American population, to the domestic, which is primarily Black, but also white. Give voice to the Asian community who have been trafficked and exploited, right? And so we try and give them each their own space, their own language, their own voice. And just walking around realizing, oh man, I've missed it. Not maybe with the best of intentions, but we've still missed it, And so there is a place of deep pain, I think, on both sides. So I don't even know where to go from that. I just, how do you sit in that place of revelation, of awakening? How do you become aware of that? And then what are the steps that we need to take, to come out of that and to redirect and to correct and to advocate appropriately?
Yeah, I think, and just first, foremost, thank you so much for sharing that piece of your story with me and with the audience. I mean, that takes a lot of courage, and I think that you're a very brave woman, okay? And the tenderness in which you're sharing your story is a testament to who you are and the love you have for all victims of human trafficking and survivors. Okay, the fact that you're feeling it to the depth of your soul in that way. I think that walking around the museum and taking it in is a huge step. Because you could easily not be walking around the museum and evaluating it that way. Many people aren't. Many people aren't walking anywhere. They're still sitting. So I think it's very poetic, and it speaks to your organization, your leadership, that you're willing to take a deeper dive in that way. Because you can make a different choice. Because you have choices that the survivors and victims don't have, but you're choosing to get in it and look at some of the ugliness of the realities of where we are. I think the tenderness in which we approach any next steps is going to be critical. We all have pain. When you were telling your story, I was thinking of how it feels for me when I walk in so many rooms and I'm the only Black leader in the room, how isolating that feels.
Yeah.
And so I was identifying with, maybe she felt isolated in that moment as she's walking through. Am I the only one that didn't recognize this or realize this? And I want to tell you, you're not. You're just the only one that's probably in this moment, in this space, acknowledging it in a way that you are. And that's why I say it takes courage for you to tell your truth, because it's your truth. That's all you got is your truth. All I have is mine. And I think that if we're able to connect our truths in a way that honors one another and brings hope to the movement, that's the best next steps as far as I'm concerned. But the acknowledgement, talking about it, and honoring your story, your story of your family. You know what I'm saying? We have biological families, but we have our true life families. I have that as well. You know, we have to build what we can build, and just want to honor them for loving you and taking you in and doing all the things that they did. And for some folks, it's probably like, how did they not talk about race? How did that not come up? I mean, seriously? Like, how? And then I think, as you were talking, because I heard the story, this is like the third or fourth time, like, they were trying to maybe protect her. It came from a place of love. Because if they would have began talking about it, then maybe she would feel isolated in her space at home. So in my heart, I'm thinking they were looking out for you and doing their best to not, in particular for African Americans and Black folks, we feel isolated so often in the world. So maybe protecting you from that as you walked your path with them and was in their home and all of that. That's what's connecting with me right now, hearing that story. So we want to honor them for protecting you. But there's some reality that we're in right now and that you're experiencing in the movement. But that framework for the love that your family had for you is going to help guide you. That piece is what's helping you walk through the museum and to look at it with open eyes. So that gives you a context to be able to do that. A lot of people are walking around the world have never had relationships with anybody that don't look like them. They have no context for that. They're like, what are you talking about? So I think it's a blessing. It's not by accident, it's by design that has been your journey. I truly believe.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, it's a conversation that has, you know, it started a few years ago. There was even, you know, yesterday when I walked the museum, it wasn't the first time I had done that, but it was the first time I had done it with fresh eyes, because it was probably a couple years ago. We had a woman come and kind of say that some of the same things. And it was the first time I had ever, I mean, I had white and I had Black, Asian, Latin American people go through the museum. But this was the first time that I had a Black woman come and tell me she didn't feel represented in the museum. And it was something where I didn't have a grid. I didn't handle it probably well. I didn't have the conversation well with her. I probably didn't know how to hear. And quite honestly, I think that I probably internally, maybe subconsciously, maybe consciously thought to myself, well, my family is Black. You don't even know me. You know,
you don't know me, like, that,
know me
girl.
like that, girl. You know, like you're
let me tell you something. No, I get it. Totally.
My defenses went up,
totally.
you know, and because, you know, like I wasn't trying to be discriminatory in that. I was trying to give people a voice. That was really the heart behind it. But in doing so, not having the fuller picture probably left things out. I know now, left things out that could be perceived as really harmful and really painful to other people who have had very different experiences than me. And so that's really where I feel like that was a flashpoint for me. And although I did not handle that conversation well, and I really, I have struggled with it for 2 years. Like it has disturbed me for 2 years. Wow. And I've just been bringing it to the Lord. I'm bringing it to my husband, you know, like, what is this? What is she talking about? Like first it was like, you don't know me like that. You need to back up. You know, and I mean, not okay. But then it was like, what are you talking about? Like, what could there, you know, maybe there's a shred of truth there. Now I see it from a very different perspective, and I go, oh man, there was a lot of pain there. There was a lot of experience that I know nothing about that was valid. And I think that's so important. Right now, I feel that just as individuals, it is so easy to get offended. It's so easy to be like, well, you didn't say that right. I don't like that term. I'm offended by that, you know, that lexicon, whatever. Before we understand the meaning behind it. And that's just something that I've been so enlightened by, of like, okay, if we're even going to have a conversation, we need to first listen. And that can be very, very trite and like listen, I don't know, all the things, but have you really sat with another person to hear their perspective before you're spouting off on social media? You know what I mean? Have we as advocates really sat with the people that we're serving and listened to their stories and listened to their experiences through the whole system that we're walking them through? You know what I mean? Before we try and help and solve. So anyways, I it's a process. And I think the conversation has to continue. Yeah. And you're so right are we willing to even sit in the discomfort, right, for a while without defensiveness, to just hear, to just listen before we respond, with the intention of saying, I may be misunderstood even, my intentions may be completely trashed, or I may be villainized, whatever it is, but have you even taken your shoes off to walk into someone's story, to listen, to hear before we make a plan of action, right? Or even a statement, And so that's something that I just value so much about you, is your grace and your intentionality to see the people, right? No matter if they differ from you, you're not threatened by that. You're like, yes, you be you, but you can still sit across the table from one another or what have you. And so I just want to thank you so much for lending your ear, lending your voice. I hope that that these conversations can continue. Specifically, I feel like today was a great starting point of where do we even start talking about this, this issue, but specifically even onto the future of how do we serve the women, the men, the children well that we're really hoping to serve, and how do we have the conversations as leaders, right? How do you in that discomfort and insecurity sometimes lead people or lead an organization or lead your followers, your donors, right? Your volunteers. How do you acknowledge them? I don't know. Maybe that's a great question for right now. What would you say?
I think, just to thank you again. I always try to sit from a place of gratitude. I think in order to even begin the conversation and continue it, you have to elevate the tough questions. Okay. And the first and foremost for me, even happened when I first came into this movement in 2015, is why the use of the word slavery? Why? Who made that choice to say modern day slavery? Yeah. Do you know what that invokes in people of color, particularly African American people? Right. Do we know that history? Yeah. So every time I'm at work and I hear slavery, it's like a trauma over and over again. So I think and I've had this conversation, and people don't understand. Yeah. And most of the time it's people. It's not people of color. It's usually Caucasian white folks who don't get that in itself, the terminology that we use can invoke things in people. And how, if we can't ask those tough questions about something like that, which defines our entire movement. Yep. I mean, people throw that word around like they're talking about ice cream or something. So true. And it's like, hold up a second. But the reality is, you haven't had the voices in the places that can make those decisions at the board level, in the seats that we're sitting in across the country. If I tell people all the time to take a poll just of Houston, of the executive director CEOs, and just Google the top 20 of them, I would put money on it that none of them are black. So if you don't have those people in leadership positions that can make those defining changes in any movement, domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual abuse, children, then that stuff is not going to shift. Because at the end of the day, that's where those major decisions are being made, are happening. So I think we want to give grace to our movement. The law just passed in 2000. Absolutely. We're in 2020. Yeah. So some of these other movements been around 100-something years. Right. So we have to be gentle. So it's kind of like when you're a kid, then you're a teenager, then you become an adult. So think about a 20-year-old kid, because you still a kid at
Yeah.
20. You know what I mean?
You're right.
You think
right.
you know what you're doing, but it's like, I don't even know, what was I thinking at
There's a wake
20?
of
Lord have
destruction behind
mercy.
you.
Yeah, totally. It's like, what happened with that? So that's what I always try to take a step back and be like, wait a second. We just got out of 19. We just hit 20. You know what I
true.
mean? So there's a patience and a tolerance that we have to have for where we are.
That's so good. I love that. That's such a good analogy. And I think, you're talking about in leadership. Let's talk like anti-trafficking movement, for example. Are there Black voices in the leadership? Or are there Black voices in the board level? Are there Black voices in the programming level, right? If not, then it is very likely, and I'm just going to bring it down to like a very base level, like example. We if we have only white hair care products at our restoration house, but 80% of the women that we're serving are Black, they're going to feel excluded and
you might want to get a couple perms and relax.
It's like very, very simple, like very obvious, should have been seen, right? But it's just, if you don't have that perspective, you're going to make mistakes that cause more harm unintentionally. Or further harm, right? And so that's something we want to be very, very mindful of. But also, I'm thinking about all the other levels of, we talked about intersectionality, like where poverty and where lack of access to education or resources or just, I don't know, chronic abuse, homelessness, some of these other
LGBTQ communities,
sexual identity, these other risk factors are so intrinsic in the fabric of the outcome, or like just the outcome of trafficking, of being exploited. We need Black voices in those movements. We need Black voices in the foster care system. Or we need Black voices in the judicial system, at the judge and at the, we need those voices in those movements so that we can actually affect change at a systemic level, because these are so intertwined. And, we talk a little bit about I feel like trafficking is kind of like this perfect melting pot of all of these vulnerabilities coming together into one terrible outcome for an individual. And the more vulnerabilities that people have, the more at risk they are, right, for being exploited. So you're right. We need to see that change come in. We need to see these populations being lifted up and Black voices being elevated in each one of these sectors. So I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Ultimately, it's on you, it's on me, and it's on every person who's listening to this podcast, and everyone that they know,
Yeah.
It is an individual decision every day when we wake up whether or not we're going to do our work.
Yeah.
It's a choice.
Yeah.
We can choose to retreat, or we can choose to continue to move forward and activate true change.
Yeah.
It's a choice. And some days I don't feel like it, to be honest.
Yeah.
However, I have a responsibility because of the seat I sit in to stay strong, stay prayed up. I pray a lot. We pray a lot.
I know you do.
We pray for each other because we have to.
Yeah.
How else are you going to do this work? This is a very dark crime and part of our culture. Okay? So we're battling against spiritual things that are so deep and so rooted so much in darkness that we have to continue to be the light. You asked me, Tamika, you've asked me this before, do you really think that way about being positive and hopeful and loving you and wanting to look into your eyes and say, I think you're amazing, Micah. I think that you're an awesome human being. I think that there's so much potential. You've grown. God is using you. I mean that, because I believe when you speak life into other people, then you speak life into yourself. And we have to speak life into this movement. And the way that we do that is speaking life into each other.
Yeah.
I truly believe that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I heard something yesterday as I'm learning, as I'm opening up my, trying to get as many tools as I can, like why it's so important to keep the conversation going. But as you're saying, to you have to, like, death and life are in the power of the tongue, right?
Totally.
So you have to speak life. You have to speak the restoration. You have to speak the prophetic vision and destiny of a generation. If you want to see
That was
change,
good.
right?
The prophetic vision. Okay, y'all write that one down. Where's that at? Who's taking notes? No, I'm kidding. No. Yeah, that was good.
But the reason for doing so, the reason for continually having this conversation is that you physically, neurobiologically, like, you can't change your mind until it's conscious. You can't change your thoughts until they're conscious. So as long as these things stay in the subconscious and stay, like, on the back burner, we can't actually physically, like you're saying, you have a choice every single morning, every day, God, to direct your will in a certain way and to direct your behaviors. And so that's one thing why we want the conversation to keep continuing. And so that we can continually be learning, continually be growing and advocating and doing it in, a life-giving, positive, but also, like, a biblical way.
Amen.
Like, what is God calling this generation to? And we can look at the riots, we can look at the violence, and we can look at the anger and the upraised fist as one thing, but I have a tendency to say, like, you know what? That's righteous anger.
I was just gonna say,
it's righteous anger, and you can't invalidate that because it's someone's experience. Now, I don't agree with violence, right? I'm not advocating for that. Let's be very, very clear.
But Micah, silence is violence too.
That's super powerful. That's very.
So where's
it's
the balance?
saying
Where's
something.
the balance?
Yeah. And so there is something that this generation carries for justice that can't be denied. Everyone says that, you look at the stats, secular, you see it. This generation is advocating for justice, and they are demanding justice. And so that part of it, that righteous indignation part of it, needs to be validated. And how do you speak life into something and kind of redirect that in a positive way? Yes, you have a voice. Yes, your anger is valid, and it is time.
Yeah.
It's time for this to be over. So how can we do this in a way that actually affects intrinsic, like, very deep-rooted systemic change? And I hope that this conversation promotes that.
Yeah.
So
I think it is, and I think just some action steps that I would recommend. Some things that we're doing at our organization. If anyone is listening and interested, it's called DEI, and it's called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Practices, and it's for businesses. It's something you can utilize in your organizations, different groups that you're involved in, and it's a very practical way to take a look at self and your businesses, your organizations, and it's something that has been really impactful to me. You can, as an organization, make a statement, put it on your website, and say, this is what we're committed to in everything that we do. And beyond training and conversations, some folks believe it's just time for action. We've been training, we've been educating. That's why they're out in the streets, because we've been talking for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And I think that just trying to find a way to equip people with knowledge, those practices are something that we're, as an organization, really pushing. And I think as a movement, we're going to lead that call through our coalition and really educating all of our coalition members. That's 70 different organizations that are in the fight.
Yeah.
So we believe we can impact change in that way.
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
you actually elevating this conversation, Micah, I mean, your heart is all over this. Your leadership is all over this. You're being elevated to places that you could have never imagined. And I've told you that when I first really sat down with you. And it's beautiful to see. And thank you so much for a platform to have this tender, kind conversation. Because that's what's going to heal all of us, is tenderness and kindness.
Yeah.
And those are not just words.
Yeah.
Acting
Yes.
with
Yes.
tenderness, acting with kindness.
Yeah.
And showing love in a way that people, and the way they need to receive it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What that looks like for them, asking them, how do I demonstrate love to you?
Yeah.
Because what I want is different than exactly.
Yeah, that's really good.
Hey, we hope that this episode of the Elijah Rising podcast has been informative, but we hope that it's been challenging too. That was a really authentic conversation that happened between two incredible women who are leading nonprofits. If you want to learn more about the work of Elijah Rising, you can visit our website at elijahrising.org. And if you want to learn more about the work of United Against Human Trafficking, you can visit their website at You can also support this podcast by subscriing, by sharing it, by telling your friends about it. And you can support the work of Elijah Rising, which produces this podcast. And again, you can visit our website, you can go to our social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, and you can shop our store at shop.elijahrising.org. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Elijah Rising podcast, and we'll see you next time.